Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to give us another 30 seconds or so for everyone to join in, and then we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Wolfson. I'm the manager at the Center of Excellence for Women's Health, and we're so happy to have you join us for the fourth and final webinar in the Learning and Acting Together series. Today, we're going to be talking about tools, resources, and guidance that support policy and practice. Before we get started, I'm just going to ask Lucy Barney to start us off in a good way.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lucy Barney. I'm from the Acute Nation, which is in the interior of British Columbia. I am the Indigenous Lead with Perinatal Services BC. And today I'm situated on the Tsawwassen First Nation, where I live and play in the town called Ladner. I appreciate the provincial program here is situated on the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish traditional territories, and are happy to be able to do their important work on the traditional lands of these coastal people. Also would like to acknowledge that you are all on the different territories within your live and play and work area. And if you could acknowledge that as well, much appreciated. Happy that you are here to join us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. So as Lucy mentioned, we find it really important for everyone to acknowledge the territory that they're coming from. I am on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, the Anishinaabeks, and the Mississauga of the New Credit. And if people want to type into the chat function where they're coming from, that would be wonderful. Our webinar today is going to be a little bit differently if you've attended the webinars in the series so far. In this fourth webinar, we're really hoping to do more of a roundtable discussion. So we have a really phenomenal group of panelists, all of whom will introduce themselves. And we're going to just have a little bit more of a fluid focus today. So what we're hoping to do is that we are going to start the webinar by talking about specific resources, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion towards the later half. And so if you have any questions as we're going through, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom. We'll have somebody monitoring the entire time, and if we don't get to your questions as they're coming up, we'll get to them at the very end during a Q&A period. So for this webinar today, our hope is to share new resources on perinatal substance use that are designed to really guide our practice and policy going forth, share a list of key resources and articles and experiences of women with lived and living experience that have been identified through the Provincial Perinatal Substance Use Project. And many of you may have noticed that yesterday when you got the reminder to join, that you also got a resource list. This is a living document that we will continue to update, and of course we'll be linking to throughout today. And then we also want to consider how these resources can be applied across various working contexts, recognizing that everyone's coming from a different place today. So with all that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Poole to get started.
Hi, I'm Nancy Poole. I acknowledge with respect that I'm calling in today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. You'll see that Indigenous cultural safety is one of a number of principles that the Perinatal Substance Use Project have and are using to guide the work. And we've been bringing these principles into the discussion of evidence and wisdom throughout the webinar series. And you'll really see them shining today through the various resources that are going to be discussed. So before we get started, I'll just mention again this resource list, and we'll send you the link. And I think you already got a copy of it with your email reminders, as she said. But you'll see in the resource list that we've really tried to honor the basic principle that has been woven through the Perinatal Substance Use Project, that there are many forms of wisdom. There's personal experience, there's research evidence, there's practice wisdom, there's the wisdom from Indigenous traditional knowledge keepers, etc. And so we've tried to really honor that in that list and really noted down the side some of those locations connected to each of the resources. And it really addresses some of the topics from today's webinar, the list, and previous webinars in the Learning and Acting Together series. And most importantly, it's not exhaustive. We were just trying to create some things that we found really super helpful as we've been doing work on perinatal substance use over the years, to not overwhelm you, but to really inspire you to bring some of the lessons from experience, research, and practice into your ongoing work. And so you'll see, as Lindsay mentioned before, that today we have panelists who have led or contributed to these to various new and emerging resources, because not all of them are completed, in each of these 4 areas of practice. And we'll get started by having each of the panelists describe the resources they've contributed to and begin to introduce them.
So these are the 2 questions that we'll be starting with. And I'm so excited to have Pam Joshi join us, who will be talking about the rooming in guidelines. So Pam, I'm hoping that you can start by giving an introduction to yourself and then just talk about the rooming in guideline.
Thank you so much. So my name is Pamela Joshi, and I'm the project manager for the Provincial Perinatal Substance Use Project at BC Women's Hospital. I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm speaking from the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations of Metro Vancouver, where I live, work, and play. I'm really fortunate to be able to present out today on the rooming in guideline. This piece of work is actually a culmination of a massive provincial effort led by the Inside Out Policy Research Consulting team and with contributors all over the province as key informants, elders, Indigenous leaders, and regional and local community champions. And very importantly, women with lived and living experience and direct care service providers. So it's really a truly provincial resource that was developed. And this resource really built on the work of Dr. Ron Abrams, the founding medical director at the FIR unit at BC Women's Hospital. And in that work, Dr. Abrams was able to establish rooming in as a really strong evidence-informed practice that supports better health outcomes for pregnant and parenting women using substances, including stronger attachment, less incidence of neonatal abstinence syndrome, and just generally more healthy outcomes for moms and babies. In this work, in the rooming in guideline, how it really expands upon that evidence-informed practice is that it really considers rooming in as consisting of 4 key areas. It has physical space, which is actually co-locating mother and baby, having safer sleeping in place, having breastfeeding and substance use considerations in place, and skin-to-skin contact as well. So within this particular guideline, there is a whole set of practices that relate to rooming in, the four that I mentioned, as well as how the mom and baby are situated in the space. And throughout all this, we're always kind of thinking about how do we work and address the stigma that pregnant and parenting women are experiencing in an acute care setting, and how do we address that through the practices of rooming in and really keeping mom and baby together at the core of this work. The last thing I'll say is that in particular, the guidance also provides some really action-oriented ways of addressing our guiding principles. So Indigenous cultural safety, trauma and violence-informed practice, recovery-oriented practice, women-centered care, is all of these principles that Nancy talked about at the beginning are featured really prominently and in action-oriented ways. So, you know, it tells us how health providers need to be encouraged or supported to do specific actions in these guiding principle areas.
So Pam, I think you, really touched upon both of the questions there. I am wondering, like, how you think that the rooming in guidelines can be used by those that maybe aren't in the BC area that might be looking to consider how they can be advancing their work where rooming in maybe hasn't been a consideration so far.
I think that's such a great question. I know that in Kingston Hospital, as an example, over the past 6 or 7 years, they've actually been able to implement rooming in quite well in Ontario. The physical space is not the only piece of rooming in. So initially when we engaged in this work, we learned that there were a lot of barriers that people were thinking, well, if I don't have a mother and baby in a private room, I actually cannot do this work. And we really went about myth busting in that area and started to think about the ethos and the practice of rooming in, how you address stigma, how you support pregnant parenting women using substances in particular, and what are the actual critical components like the environment being low stimulation, clustering care, and other clinical aspects that really have generalizability across acute care settings and can be managed in even a shared mother-baby environment in an acute care hospital-based setting.
That is great. Thank you so much, Pam, for that really wonderful introduction.
Good. So I'm Yola Bergman. I'll introduce myself, and first just want to say thank you to Lucy for her great acknowledgement of the land. I share PSBC with her, and I cannot do it any better than she did that. So I work with PSBC. I am the neonatal care coordinator for perinatal services. As you can hear from my accent, I'm not Canadian born, but I'm a happy immigrant for the last 25 or so years. I'm originally from South Africa. I'm a NICU nurse by training, and therefore babies really is my focus, but I do think the overall and overarching principle of what we're doing today is to really look at the mother and the baby as a dyad, because often when we start working with babies, we seem to forget the other side of it. And now we actually, at last, we're bringing them together. The resources I would like to touch on and that I work with is really focusing on the Ubc Pd Learning E-Module. That is a big work. We've worked very hard on it. It was done in collaboration with people from BC Women's, Fraser Health, and also I reached out to other stakeholders across the province. And the whole idea about this model is for people just to get used to looking at these babies and not just call them the NAS babies, but actually look at what's happened to them, what is the physiology, the symptoms that they come with, and how we can change how we actually support these babies in the care of and how we care for them. And the main thing that we brought in was actually changing the assessment model, moving away from the Finnegan. That was really just a catalog of these symptoms. And really, I think didn't really help with the management of these babies. And we moved towards what I said is the functional based assessment. You may have heard about it, the Eat, Sleep and Console care tool. And that really, we look at these babies, how they're eating, sleeping and consoling. And that applies to all habit forming substances right through the pregnancy. So it's not just opiates, whether it's too much coffee, or whether there's other stimulants involved, it will affect how the baby eats, sleep, and console. And if we use that, how we can then support the baby. And more than that, bringing the mother as the primary caregiver, and she will be able to sort of give that baby very important responsive care the baby needs. And it's all really focused on preventing toxic stress syndrome, because we do know if we do not provide that social buffering, that immediate care, when the baby cries, pick the baby up, we end up having some epigenetic changes that can affect this baby for the rest of his or her life. And I think it is our responsibility, and I think it's an amazing privilege we have to try and put this baby and mom on the right way for life, for the beginning of life. So that is in short. And in the next slide, I can just show you two other. This is the tool, the one that the black and white copy is the actual tool. That's your Eat, Sleep, and Consult tool. They will be both in hard copy and electronic format. And then the next thing that the group developed was a treatment algorithm to sort of just guide how you, as a suggestion, how we can actually manage these babies. And the whole idea is really to stay within the orange block, where you do the Eat, Sleep, and Consult assessment. You support the baby by implementing non-pharmacological care methods. Try and stay away from morphine unless it's truly necessary. And if it is, then to see if a PRN dose of morphine will be useful before we start maintenance. But the overarching factor here is keep mom and baby together, back to what Pam was saying, and use non-pharmacological methods to try and support the baby. Thank you.
Paula, it's so interesting, you know, how the direction this resource is taking us. Again, as you say, not as much a pharmacological approach, but also not as much of a checklist kind of approach in the old style. And maybe you can just talk about how this differs from the former Finnegan list approach a bit.
Yeah, and as you can see, it's going to look like the Finnegan, because I figured that was one of the easiest way to transition. So we just take one form out and put the other one in, but the questions are very different. It is not a scoring tool. There is no scorer related to it. So when we do use numbers, it's mainly coding. So it's easier for the bedside caregiver to actually document. That will not even be a problem in electronic health records, because it would just be a drop-down box. So that's the big difference. We're not actually scoring the baby to see where they land, and it's not going to dictate if you're 8 and above, you're going to start morphine. We're actually looking, just asking the question, is the baby eating poorly? Yes, but then we look at the reason for that. Is it due to substance withdrawal, or is there another thing? We do know babies often that first 24 hours, especially with C-sections, will be mucousy. They may not eat as well. That is not substance withdrawal. And it's just to try and tease out, the baby still needs support in eating, but the reasoning of it is different. And just for us always to look at what can we consider before we just fall back onto substance withdrawal. And even if it is substance withdrawal, what else can we do? I think years ago when I came to this country, this was a new subject for me. And all I saw was these babies that they were burrito wrapped, very tightly swaddled and placed in a dark corner in a room. And they had to eat every 3 hours. There's all the noise of the ICU around them, and their mothers were not there. That all goes with toxic stress syndrome. And this is the change we need to see, is to try and normalize these babies, give them to their moms, put them where they need to be, and support them in that way.
I think it's so powerful to be able to see them and to understand it from that very simple way of eat, sleep, console, rather than coming at it through a clinical checklist kind of way. And I think it's a really powerful change, although it doesn't look like one here.
It does. That was trying to get the change management going.
In the place that they're comfortable coming from, in order to help them see differently. And I just think it's a really amazing project, and hopefully will fundamentally shift the stigma.
It's been an amazing privilege to be part of this.
Yeah. So these two resources that we've just talked about will be in this section. The one of them already is there. In the maternity care section of the resource list, and it just gives you a bit of a snapshot of a few of the other things that are in that list as well. But hopefully people will find it really helpful to be able to turn to the list to find this kind of material about the maternity care part of this work. So Allison, do you want to begin to talk a little bit about what you're working on? Introduce yourself first, of course.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Alison Sulcado, and I am coming to you from New Westminster and the place of the Acute First Nation, also known as the New Westminster Indian Band. The band has been located in New West for a long, long time, and is one of the smallest First Nations in Canada and the only First Nation without a land base. So a little bit about the background of the project. The housing framework that I'm working on is an insights report on what the stock supply currently is, a little bit of the composition of the housing needs, what it takes to, what it would look like currently, and what we can reimagine future that would be helpful to mom and babe to thrive. To look for, at this stage, we've completed a number of interviews across the province with a wide range of stakeholders, housing providers, wraparound service providers, referral partners, and that's what I've been piecing together.
Such a key piece, eh?
Undoubtedly, and as I've had these conversations, it's been a reality check and a bit of heartbreak too, to hear the challenges around housing, because all of this wonderful work is required to take place in safe, affordable housing, and just having the roof over your head quite often is not adequate. So as we go forward, I've broken down all the housing accommodations into crisis interventions or shelters, supported housing with supports, independent housing, and more permanent supported housing if there was a critical need. So breaking it down as we move along the project.
So you're trying to map that out in your work? Is that the process of looking at what the continuum of housing might be?
That is correct. And how you transition from one to the other, step down, step up, and working with the key partners that we've had in the process right now, so that we can take what we've learned from what works with them and what gaps they've identified, and enhance the service delivery with housing and the wraparound services going forward.
Well, that'll be a big contribution for sure. It's, you know, in all of the research that we have done at the Center of Excellence, we have certainly seen that housing comes up in everybody's wish list, right? That we had more housing and more stepped housing.
Absolutely. So taking a women-centered, client-centered approach, where everything is within reach. Hopefully, as we build this out in a format that we've heard needs to be accessible, walkable, all the supports are right around, so not everybody's in institutional or a facility, but it's, sorry, somebody said they can't hear me. Is that better?
Yeah, it would help if you.
Okay, I'm just going to move the camera a little closer to me.
Great.
Thank you. So yes, trying to identify what works. There are a number of systems, a number of agencies right now that are currently delivering service that is working well. So understanding that and understanding the gaps that they have identified to enhance the service delivery as we move forward. That's part of my work, and identifying resources that providers or individuals can access, as having a roadmap, so to speak, as to how they can go along. The previous visual would kind of show that, where a woman and babe can actually access it and walk their way through, right? Have the resources they need when they need it. And the continuum of housing along the back shows the different states, from critical care to more independent, back to supports, depending on where they are in their journey.
Well, that will be a great contribution. Thanks, Allison. So the work that you do will turn up, I assume, in the list in the housing options for pregnant women, new mothers, and families when you get there. But it is one of the areas I think that is most pressing and of major interest in the work going forward. So really glad the Perinatal Substance Use Project has commissioned you to do some serious thinking about it.
I just saw a comment on the chat about MCFD. So the wraparound services do include conversations with MCFD and things that we've learned along the way, everything from access to affordable, digital technology and pieces where anything that would be supportive. So it's a little bit more than just housing.
Great. Okay, well, let's carry on and hear from Lucy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. The resource I'm talking about is still in draft form, but I'm very proud to present where we're at right now and what's included in the resource. The resource is called Honoring Indigenous Women's Resilience, because we know Indigenous women are resilient. It's a healthcare practice resource created by aunties, mothers, grandmothers, daughters, and sisters to support culturally safe and humble trauma-informed perinatal care with Indigenous women and families. And it was created by many women throughout the whole province, whether they're nurses, midwives, moms, grandmothers, sisters. It's an awesome resource. And this resource provides a history of how Indigenous women and families were strong, vibrant, self-determining women as matriarchs in their own community. It shares some cultural practices such as coming of age ceremony that taught girls and boys to respect self and others. It also shares the welcoming baby ceremony, where family and community come together to welcome the baby into the world, into the whole family, into the community, and that it's the responsibility of everyone to raise this child in a respectful way. It also talks about what sorry, people like to call a lot. It also talks about what changed this, the imposition of policies like the Indian Act that took away our way of being as the backbone of our community. The imposition of the residential school, 60 scoop, and now the millennial scoop. These policies disempowered the women and families. It also took away ceremonies we practiced that kept us strong, cohesive, and respectful of the fact women were sacred and have the ability to bring life into the world. The resources shares why Indigenous women and families turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms such as alcohol use, substance use, and others. You can see the braid theory on the screen, where many Indigenous people are overrepresented in many physical diseases such as HIV, heart disease. Some of our babies die from SIDS. Some of our babies are born with FASD. Some of our parents smoke while pregnant, and these physical issues that our women experience every day find it difficult to become diagnosed with these things because of everything that affects us under the mind, like the addictions that we turn to for coping, like the oppression that our people experience through the Indian Act, the changing of our role in society, in our own societies as being the backbone of our community. And with the outlawing of our culture, we became very weak. So it was very difficult for our women to access healthcare. The resource shares 6 principles on cultural safety and cultural humility and trauma-informed approach to care, using the 4 R's framework of cross-cultural dialogue, which is really important. And it takes away the onus away from the Indigenous woman and puts it on the healthcare provider to adjust and understand the unique needs of the individual that is there in front of them. And it's respect of Indigenous women of who they are, provides Indigenous women with information that is relevant to their view of the world, encourages reciprocity in their relationships, and it enables the client to exercise responsibility over their own health. And the 6 principles of this resource is cultural safety and cultural humility, which we've all learned a lot about. It talks about self-determination, because that self-determination was taken away from us, and now we're reclaiming that self-determination by hoping that our our agencies and our organizations and our health systems. Sorry. Self-determination that was taken away from us, and that we're reclaiming all of this. And it's trust through relationships that we're going to get through this together. And really important is to respect that Indigenous women have traditional practices that kept them strong. Being aware Indigenous women live in a context of colonial trauma because of the Indian Act, the residential school system, the millennial scoop, the 60s scoop. Healthcare providers can think about their own routine practice, ways of doing things, and saying things from the lens of someone who has been through trauma. What will you say or do potentially may trigger that person? Another principle is anti-Indigenous racism, which we've heard a lot about, and looking at the strength and resilience-based practice with our Indigenous women. So when we weave the science of pregnancy and looking at the mind, what affects our women, and bring in our cultural practices such as coming of age, what teaches the woman and the man transitioning into adulthood, and the welcoming baby ceremony. When this baby is born into the world, it is sacred, it is welcomed. When we have these ceremonies, it's a tool that will help prevent our babies from going into care. And it will help our women to reclaim their resiliency, building on their strength of who they are as a people. And so this resource, sorry, go ahead.
No, go please.
This resource builds on the strength of the Indigenous cultural practices, beliefs, and values. It also includes Indigenous women's stories and case studies healthcare providers can learn from in providing a cultural safety, cultural humility, and trauma-informed approach to care. Because you never know who's in front of you. It also has a section called Auntie Lucy's Reflections, which summarizes each section and how to move forward in a good way. And the women with lived experience have participated by sharing their stories with us. And we use the principles to share how healthcare providers can use this as a tool when working with their Indigenous women clients or even other women in their role. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I'm so excited to see this resource. It seems like you have packed a lot of information in, but in a way that's really accessible by having these different components, by having the Ask Auntie Lucy, where providers can look to what your advice may be, having women's voices included, and then having imagery such as the one that you've provided on the screen, so that way, no matter where folks are situated, they can really learn and advance their practice forward. So I know that I personally, and I imagine many others on the call, are really excited to see the resource when it comes out. And that resource will be highlighted in this section, Trauma-Informed Strengths-Based Approaches. And we have a couple of other resources in here. One is the Indigenous Harm Reduction Principles and Practice, and then Revitalizing Culture and Healing, Indigenous Approaches to FASD Prevention. But of course, we'll be adding Honoring Indigenous Women's Resilience within this section as well once it's released.
Thank you.
Great. So over to you, Hawk Feather, to talk a little bit about your work.
Hi there, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. The work that I do is predominantly advocating for myself and my community as a person with lived and living experience as a substance user. And I do find, I tell people, I think my job is largely to be the troublemaker. I'm here to flag problems in a way that only someone with lived experience can. And that ends up being largely what we do when we're advocating for our community. Unfortunately, there's still so much stigma. It's so pervasive to still see discrimination against substance users. We still see a lot of this good work wrapped around archaic ideology around substance use that kind of attributes sobriety to being, superior or more ethical, and it leaves women and parents in this really precarious situation still, where the cost of disclosure is massive, and still not a lot of acknowledgement that child apprehension is still absolutely a deeply traumatic and an ongoing issue for our people. I do think that having people with lived and living experience directly impacting policies and all, care and everything, every step of the way, it's really fundamental. But I still see that we're often just kind of brought in as an afterthought. There's still a lot of tokenistic approach to how people with lived experience are actually engaged. There's still not very many, if any, leadership positions for people with lived and living experience. We're often brought in to, review. That's often what we do. We review and we sit and listen and periodically chime in and say, that sounds really stigmatizing, or and then whether or not it changes or not is relative. But yeah, it's a frustrating position to be in. I'm seeing some greater inclusion of people with lived and living experience, and that comes off the direct work and backs of people with lived and living experience fighting for our inclusion at different tables. But still predominantly the work still often revolves around striving for abstinence. And that leaves a really large gap and creates a really large barrier for a lot of folks that are active substance users. It's a big problem still. How we're seen and how we're treated is still a really big problem. Stigma is still, I think, one of the biggest issues that we're combating, and all these resources and everything that we're doing to try to better the lives of substance using parents. Unless some of those basic ideologies change, then I don't really see the treatment changing in the long run. I'm really grateful that this good work is being done to ensure that policies are at least safe and culturally informed and trauma informed. That to me is a big step, but a big step within the framework of baby steps, kind of. So I'm still hopeful that we're going to make room for leadership positions for people with lived and lived experience, that people will be participating in early steps rather than only after the fact, that we're going to be doing more education and awareness around safe supply and active substance use and the ability to parent while being an active substance user, because that's still considered taboo, but it's a reality for tons of parents. So yeah, I see lots of room for growth, and I'm grateful for the steps that have come thus far.
Thank you so much. That is brilliant. I think your points are so well made. That idea about integration from the get-go, I think, is especially important, and maybe even turning it on its head to say, start with the lived experience and then move to the other steps, right? To really get a good sense of where we need to go. And I think your voice and the voice of all the others that have been involved in creating these resources and in informing us as researchers and policymakers and practice leaders is really important. And I especially like your point about putting people with lived experience in the leadership position as opposed to the consultant position. I think that's a very powerful way for us to see social justice be achieved, and to focus, as you say, not only on on substance use, but on determinants of health overall, as what we're trying to be guiding women around.
You know, Nancy, one thing I always say, I'm hoping that people are redefining the term recovery, and that recovery will no longer mean abstinent, but it will mean well-being. And yeah, I think that all the things you just touched upon will help that, and just seeing us, hearing us, more opportunities to be heard and seen, and positions for folks that are active users and not just abstinent. I think it'll all make a big difference. So yeah. Thank you for including
I
me.
really like that idea of changing the definition of recovery. And I think it is in that process of being changed by everyone at this point. And really, really remarkable shift to see the many roads, you know, one journey. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's so much that needs to be written and shared on this work. We've put a few things in the Empowering Mothers part of this resource list, but really want that to stand as an important contribution of you know, things we need to be factoring in as we do this work. So we put a few things there, but lots more to be learned as we go along. And I hope that you are able to put some of your lessons to paper so that people can benefit, as well as hearing you, you know, in contexts like this, Hot Feather. Yeah, so let's turn to talking together a bit about you know, the work that's being done. And I just feel like all of this work is really part of some significant strides in improving our response to and involving pregnant and newly parenting women in their care. And I guess I just wanted to come back to this idea about what have the resources you're working on, how are those new? How do you think that is exactly, you know, what's needed to bring some service providers and policy makers and health system planners forward? So the aspect of newness of your resource, what is it adding? And maybe I'll start with you, Pam. Do you want to jump in first and just start the discussion on it?
Sure. I think there are a few things about the resource that really makes it new in terms of rooming in. Having that conversation about the physical space and kind of putting that aside a little bit, and then talking about it more of like sort of an overarching practice, and including the other components of rooming in, and having a really holistic look about, you know, what does that mother and baby's life look like in those first few days or weeks in the hospital setting, and really thinking that through in depth. You know, one of the times we had a conversation about it, Hawk Feather, you know, raised that issue of stigma and really, you know, encouraged us and wanted us to put that in the foreground as well, and put it in the foreground in a way that people can change and shift their practice and interact with guiding principles in a way that that addresses stigma all the way through. So that's something that we did with the guidance. And I think the third thing I'll just say is that Indigenous cultural safety is actually woven all the way through. So whether we're talking about, you know, having space for ceremony and having space for elders and family members, whether we're talking about, you know, how you move in a trauma space with an Indigenous woman and family, it really is woven all the way through, and it's a huge area and source of pride for, I think, the project team and the group that have worked on it. Just having Indigenous providers circle participate in that work, having Indigenous key informants and reviewers and elders look at the work, as well as women with lived and living experience.
Yeah. So, I think that is a huge contribution, and, you know, so that it doesn't become Ron Abrams alone now, it feels a lot like what's especially new is the whole range of people who are claiming it and naming it and practicing it. And I think that is a huge contribution to see that pulled out from one wonderful doctor's start for us all as a leader to a claiming of it that is so much broader and has so many possibilities for it continuing to be shaped. Yeah. Lucy, what about the resource you're doing? I mean, you spoke to it in some ways, but what does it really add, that you see as absolutely critical to this work at this point?
Thank you, Nancy. Self-determination is something that is really important, and I feel, and many other women feel, that they really haven't had the opportunity to make the choice to understand what it is that they're going through. And we talk about informed consent, but a lot of women don't sometimes understand what is being taught or told of them of what's going to happen and what's being prescribed to them. And so it's important for Indigenous women to understand what is being said of them so that they can be self-determining and make that decision. The other thing that is really important and new is respect that, the Indigenous women have traditional practices that kept them strong. For a long time, the ceremonies were not allowed to be held in hospital settings or acute care settings because of the need to move through things fast. And whereas if you take things slower, you'll be able to build that trusting relationship with your client. And to be aware, that Indigenous women want these ceremonies because it keeps them strong, it keeps them calm, and it keeps them in a place where they feel safe. And so being aware also that Indigenous women live in a context of colonial trauma. It's intergenerational trauma that our people are experiencing now due to the residential school system, that really happened. Those are real stories that are being told. And our people are still experiencing these traumas today. And we're trying to find ways of working on this. You see many, many women that have gone missing throughout the whole country. And why are they leaving home? Why are they missing? And that we need to bring these ceremonies back into the setting. The system needs to take the time to plan and to support Indigenous women so that there is less involvement of these babies being taken away, and that women are able to grow and be themselves as Indigenous women, matriarchs, and the backbone of our community.
So Hawkfeather, what do you think about both the Indigenous standalone resource and the integration of Indigenous ideas throughout all the resources? You've spoken so well about the substance use side, but what about the Indigenous side? How are you seeing the involvement of how do you see the newness of us talking about indigeneity in this way as emerging? Do you see progress there?
Somewhat, I do. I see more inclusion of ceremony. I think it would be funny if it wasn't heartbreaking that something so traditional and ancient is new. Because it's not new at all, but I still think we aren't doing enough to reconcile the historical damage. We have clients that they come in and it's they don't even have not enough has been done to reconcile that they don't have the family supports that they need because their mothers have been abused and traumatized by the 60s scoop, and then their grandmothers have been traumatized by the residential schools So, you know, without healing those wounds, then we leave these young parents without that beautiful wraparound family. So when I hear people talk about bringing, you know, tradition back to people, I think that it's beautiful. It's so beautiful. And, you know, as I'm a settler, I can't really speak to like Indigenous cultural, you know, reality very much other than my appreciation for it. But I also see that, you know, substance using parents, they lose that celebration of having a new child. There isn't the same recognition that you're having a rite of passage unfolding around you and that it's celebrated and beautiful. If you see parents leaving the hospital with balloons and flowers and joy, and you see a substance using parent, it's not the same. They're not celebrated. They're just tolerated. Mm-hmm. And it's not in any way children should be brought into the world. You know, the things that you celebrate when you're a substance using parent are so minimum and basic. You're celebrating whether or not you get to see your child or touch your child or hold your child. And it's just such a traumatic thing to lose that beauty of celebration of having your child. It needs to change. It needs to shift. We still just need so much to return the beauty of birth and pregnancy to folks that are substance users. And I want to see my clients joyful that they found out they're expecting instead of terrified. And they're not terrified in the same way that all new parents are terrified. They're terrified that they won't get to keep their children, right? From that first pregnancy test, you know, you hear people saying, well, I have to detox this weekend. And that's not even a safe practice, but that's the go-to mechanism I see people. And even if they have that deep primal love for their child, there's so many barriers between experiencing it that they just don't get to have the joy that comes with you know, having a baby. And I think that that's a big part of starting out right. You're starting out, we have, you know, culturally informed meetings where we have Indigenous elders start our meetings in a good way. And we know the importance of starting things in a good way, but there's no real recognition that we don't get to start the lives of our children in a good way for substance users. We started amongst trauma, and it's very medicalized, and it's very mechanical, and it's very sterile. And even when done right, there's so many rules and so many barriers between just being blissed out with your new baby, right? That's rare to happen. Yeah. So.
And that's where I think some of the ceremony that you talked about, Lucy, is really an opening for everyone to be able to honor what has happened and to be able to move forward with some of those teachings. I think will be a real gift to us all in the process. Yola, I just want to turn to the last question and maybe start with you, in terms of, you know, how you see us going forth from here. What else is there from your location that, you know, that we have yet to do?
I think from my perspective, just looking at the care of the baby, I have been able to do a lot of education and promote the new, which is not new, by the way. It's common sense. Baby care is not new. It's just our recognition. That's the way we should do it. That's new.
Exactly.
Yeah, and also recognizing epigenetic changes that we all now agree with. For me, mainly, this will only work if we do that wraparound services. If we can enable mom and baby stay together. And again, if there is unfortunately the chance of apprehension, that doesn't mean we need to separate mom and baby. And then whatever I'm doing right now only really pertains to that first week of the baby's life. From my perspective, looking from the baby side, it is to get everything else around the mom and the baby to work to keep them together. and to support them to stay together. And that's really me looking at everyone else at the table as well, and what we can do to do that.
The mom baby togetherness principle.
Nothing, that is 99% of what we need. And we need everyone to understand, and as Hawk Feather really beautifully stated, is to celebrate that mother as well, and celebrate the family and the stigma. So there's no use for anyone to go into the learning module on the baby, or even look at the hard copy, or even the Eat, Sleep, the consult tool, if they have not looked at trauma-informed and culturally safe care, and they actually start with how are they going to relate to the mum and her family.
Yeah,
it won't be. It is a complete package.
Yeah. Pamela, do you want to jump in on what's a key issue that we've yet to do?
I think the piece about mother and baby togetherness, and I've been really vibrant in the chat here in the last few minutes, just responding to some things that we are working on as a provincial project, and looking at that interface between child welfare and child removals and what's happening there, and how, as a part of the provincial project, we are developing acute care social work training to support social workers in hospital-based settings, to keep mother and baby together, to look at that practice of how birth alerts have been eliminated, to look at rooming in, and to look at Eat, Sleep, Console, and to really just kind of expand upon all the alternatives and possibilities and strengths of a mother, and move away from removal entirely. So that's really what we're hoping to achieve in our work provincially as well, in addition to all the great resources and supports everyone has talked about.
Great. Thanks for adding in the chat like that. You've answered so many things there. Allison, anything on your wish list that we'd take on in maybe a subsection of the housing that's particularly needed?
I think just the volume, the need to prioritize that as part of my work in this project, I've come to realize, as it's adjacent space to the provincial medical piece, but it's an adjacent space, that the national housing strategy that we have now, of the 8 criteria, the mums and babies would fit 6 of them. So that's a really a good tie-in to agencies that want to develop housing independently, that this is a good time where there's a commitment to that. So just identifying pieces that might be helpful as a resource, while it's not help, but it's an adjacent space.
Yeah. And Lucy, do you want to finish us off with one thing you have on your wish list as an issue or an approach that you wish we'd take on?
Sure, and I think everyone's doing it already, and I thank the organizations that are providing culturally safe and trauma-informed care. But I think, for women who have not experienced their culture, that the settings, the hospital settings, have to plant that seed with the woman so that she can feel that pride and celebrate bringing a life into the world. That will change a lot in her whole way of being, in her mind, in her body, and in her spirit. She will come alive.
That is such a nice way to end.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate all of you for coming today. And yeah, do you want to take us out, Lindsay?
Sorry about that. Thank you everyone so much for joining us, not only for this webinar, but for the 3 past. As you exit today, you're going to notice that there's an evaluation. We'd love to see your thoughts and perspectives on this different format, but just overall, your perspectives on the webinar series. We're really excited to see all of these resources come out, and cannot thank our panelists enough for this lively and thought-provoking conversation today. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.